Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us at Childcare and Education Virtual Summit. I'm delighted to be here today with our panellists who have got a great session lined up for you on leadership, quality and support. So how can providers thrive in 2023? June O'Sullivan from the London Early Years Foundation is going to be chairing the panel. So June, I will hand over to you.
Hi, thank you, Lisa. And as Lisa's just said, we have a very interesting panel and a panel of people who actually work right in the heart of the sector. So it's always very useful to get their perspective. So just as Lisa said, my name is June O'Sullivan and I'm the Chief Executive of the London Early Years Foundation. And I am not going to say much today. I'm going to try and collate what everyone else says, then disturb them by asking some difficult questions and then pull it together at the end. So I'm obviously going to start with Neil because he's the most experienced on this panel and I think he should have the hardest questions to start with. So yeah, over to Neil.
Thanks, June. So I'm Neil Leach. I'm the Chief Executive of the Early Years Alliance, which is a membership organisation. In fact, it's the largest in England.
Very good, thank you. So should we do boy, girl, because we've got a panel of very equal today. So I think maybe we go to Jessica next.
I am Jessica Sandor. I am one of our area directors for Busy Bees Day Nurseries, which is the UK's largest chain of day nurseries.
Thank you, Jessica. Then obviously, Mark, you're going to be next.
Hi, so yeah, I'm Mark James. I'm currently their quality assurance and registration lead at Tiny, which is the childminder agency of 400 childminders, and an early years consultant for nurseries as well.
Thank you, Mark. And last but by no means least, we have Preeti.
Thank you, June. I'm Preeti Patel. I'm Head of Education at Montessori Centre International, which is part of the Montessori Group. We are a Montessori teacher training college.
Marvellous. There's a lady I'd love to have dinner with, Maria Montessori. It'd be most interesting to have a chat with her about the world we live in. Anyway, I'm going to kick you off with questions that have actually been sent to me by Expo, but I never stick to anything, as you all know. So I'm just going to go with the first question as it stands. It's a pretty general question, really, so you can take it any which way you like. But it would be great to hear some of your answers with relation to what it feels like to be a leader in the sector and what it must feel like to be a child in the sector as well. So, Neil, could you tell us how the current economic climate impacts on nurseries and preschool in the UK? In words of, 2 syllables and not for 2 hours.
I think it's pretty obvious. It's grim at this particular point in time. I describe the sector as being in crisis, and I have to say, June, I don't use that word lightly. I've been around the sector about 20 years and I've never witnessed anything like it. We have a recruitment and retention crisis that, in terms of staff, that hasn't eased in any way whatsoever. I was interested, we did a survey a year ago and actually it has not improved in any way. In fact, in many areas, my colleagues tell me that it is worse. We have no margin whatsoever because we've been starved, dare I say, of funding for decades. And it's not just me saying that, even government has acknowledged finally that it doesn't adequately fund the so-called free entitlements. So when you have a position whereby you get the slightest squeeze, whether that's energy, whether it's food prices, whether it's rents, rates, whatever it is, there is no margin whatsoever. And I suggest that's why we've seen something like 4,000 providers close their doors in the last 12 months, something like 20,000 in the last 6 years. So yeah, it's a pretty grim position and we are all struggling. Final thing I'd say on that is we are also a provider in our own right. So we operate 61 settings, almost exclusively in areas of deprivation. Mm-hmm. This time 3.5 years ago, we had 132. So again, I'd like to think that when we talk about the challenges, we do it with first-hand experience and it isn't just rhetoric, it's a reality.
Thank you, Neil. Jessica, do you want to pick up on that, particularly from the perspective of Busy Bees as a large provider?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously we, like you said, are a very large provider and we do provide mainly private childcare. We have some funding options. We've seen a difference across the landscape, really. obviously coming out of the pandemic, what we found was a lot of our kind of community-based nurseries had built themselves up during kind of the pandemic, and then as people have gone to work, that's also changed the dynamic back again. But what I think a lot of parents found as well was that they could potentially find ways to juggle childcare being at home, and so that's then obviously impacted us within the sector. However, what we were trying to put a focus on was making sure that we really support that home learning aspect as well, because the children then are obviously not getting access to the education that we provide and those social interactions. So we've been trying to put a focus on for 2023 how we can build those relationships with parents, so that even if they're not necessarily accessing our provision as much, the children aren't noticing any difference or as limited difference as possible within their outcomes, because we're able to support more while we have them, but while they're at home as well, kind of fostering those relationships really carefully.
So just to be clear then, you're saying that actually a lot of your families can't afford to attend full time anymore, particularly those who are on the government funding.
Yeah, it's the realistic thing to say. You know, I think that obviously everything's going up so much and people can't afford what they could afford before. However, I think equally it's important to acknowledge that people have found different ways to cope and different ways to manage their childcare. That if your mortgage has gone up by £400 a month now, you know, that's those 3 days that you were spending at nursery that you don't have that money to draw on. So we have to be realistic in how we're looking to help, I think, is what's really important.
Thank you, Jessica. It's really clear. Thoughts on that, particularly from a childminding perspective?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Until 6 months ago, I joined Tiny 6 months ago, having spent 10 years in nurseries. So it was a very, very different step for me, having, you know, left the nursery provision, which was really struggling, huge recruitment and retention issues, and coming into an agency, which I suppose is a strange place to be in early years at the moment, because the agency model of childminders is growing. So it's a very different kind of challenge that we're facing. But then if you look at childminders in general, they have massively reduced across the UK. So we've lost 50% of our childminders in the last 10 years. Now, agencies still make up a very, very, very minor percentage of what we've lost, and nowhere near at covering that gap. So we represent 400 childminders, as well as partnering with another organisation that represents 700. And we are growing quite rapidly. So we're growing at about 30 to 40 childminders a month. And we get a huge number of inquiries for childminders. Our challenge is making sure, particularly from the safeguarding team, with our focus really being on high quality, is making sure that our quality bar remains where it is. So just because we're getting these huge level of inquiries doesn't mean that they're the right sort of people to become childminders. We get a lot of inquiries from people that haven't worked in early years before. So making sure that they're really aware of what that entails, and kind of making sure the message of early education and care is really pushed through, rather than it being just about care. That's my big bugbear, is to constantly, you know, the mantra that it's a safe place to be and nothing more, and making sure that we're really preaching that in childminders about it being an educational environment. But from a financial point of view, I think on the ground for childminders, they're in the strange position where they haven't got the same overheads that nurseries would have, but they've also got this real challenge at the moment with rise of living costs. So, you know, they're having to look at what decisions to make, whether they can afford to provide food, how they maintain the same service for different families, and also going back to what Jessica was saying about the parents affording fees. What we're finding is that there are a lot less children doing full-time care, and when you've only taken 3 or 4 children that are early years children, one of those might be your own, trying to fill that gap of 3 in the Tetris puzzle that never quite fits together, and supporting childminders to make sure that sometimes they might need to turn a family away and not just take whatever's coming through the door, because we're getting a lot less inquiries for full-time care in childminding settings. So I think from their point of view on the ground, that's a real challenge, to make sure that they're being business focused in maximising what they can make to make sure they're getting a decent living for themselves.
Thank you very much. And then finally, Pretty, what does it look like from the world of Montessori?
Well, I think you know, everybody else on the panel has really highlighted the issues that are sort of prevalent across the sector, you know, whether you're a private daycare nursery, whether you're a childminder, whether you are sort of supporting sort of settings in, you know, deprived areas. I think the challenges are the same. You know, the cost of living crisis is having a huge impact. We are sort of we were only just beginning to recover from COVID, and now we've been hit by something else. So I think this is across the sector, and the challenges remain. So I think with a lot of practitioners, though, they're looking at alternative careers now because of this, and this isn't helping the sector in any way. So, you know, the fact that we don't have practitioners who can go and work in the settings is very much sort of indicative of the issues that are in the sector. You know, there isn't a good sort of pay scale, so people can't work there because they can't meet their own living costs. So those are the kind of challenges I think we're as a sector having to think about.
Sure. And none of this sadly is unrecognizable to anybody. And your point about crisis, Neil, I always think of crisis as something that happens and then is resolved. I wonder if it's more than a crisis now. It's become a kind of modus operandi, really, that we're always on the edge and we're always operating in this way. But I would say that one of the things that challenges us at the moment, and I'm just wondering on your thoughts on this, because we have, I think it's 14 separate ministers we've had in as many years. Is it? I mean, I'm sure there's a quiz out there where one of you can actually tell me. And if there isn't, we should have it in a Christmas quiz, actually. In fact, I probably will put it in a Christmas quiz. But we now have another Secretary of State for Education. And let me think who it is. Who is it? Oh, yes, Gillian Keegan. And we have, I think, the same minister for the moment, though we haven't been told, have we, if Kelly Tolhurst is staying or going. But you know, do you not think that has something to do with us not having therefore a proper strategy, you know, a sense of where we're going, you know, a well-functioning sort of set of thoughts about how we should deliver our services, and underpinned by, you know, a proper budget like an organisation would?
June, let me answer your question first of all. Kelly Tolhurst has gone, so she is not there. But it's not really been announced, but it is official, but she's not on the DfE website any longer, so she's gone. And your answer about the turnover in terms of, I can see you smiling, in ministers, etc. In the last 10 years, we have had 22 early years ministers and Secretary of States.
Are you serious? 22?
Absolutely serious.
Oh, my giddy aunt.
In fact, I have this visual that I've been using over the years in terms of the ministers that we have. I've run out of space, actually. And so in any other walk of life, turnover like that would just absolutely ring alarm bells. And it would ring alarm bells in terms of leadership, continuity, etc. But somehow when it comes to early years and the education system, absolutely fine. And what I think that's led to is every new minister that comes in has a desire to bolt just a little bit more onto an existing chaotic hybrid system that has got no strategy, it has got no vision. And in fact, if you asked a minister, and I've suggested when I've been interviewed in the past that if any of the radio or TV shows manage to get a minister on, ask them this question. What do you think that parents, for example, should be paying as a percentage of their salary in 5 years' time? What do you think an educator, teacher working in the early years environment should be paid in 5 years' time? What is their progression? You will not get an answer, because the point that you make is there is no strategy, there is no vision, and there is no operational plan. And that's why we sort of lurch from one crisis to the next. And so if you ask me about leadership, I would sort of say that is everything that you don't want. What you do want is continuity. You want priority. We don't view, I think it was Mark that might have said we don't consider that early years is part of the education system. We consider it as glorified babysitting, basically. It needs to move up the agenda. We need a minister with a backbone. And as you well know, I've for a long time now said that, frankly, we need to do what other countries have done. We need a minister of state for the early years. Then all of a sudden it will become important. Then we will recognize the value of it. Then we will treat the people that work in the sector in the way in which they deserve to be treated. And that's not just about money. It's really interesting, Preeti, when you said people are leaving the sector and you implied in droves, it is money is the third biggest reason. It is not the biggest reason.
Yeah.
It is about them being undervalued. The first reason is about them being undervalued and exhausted.
Yeah.
You're right, Neil. I think it takes special people to work in the sector. And so money does go down the line for them. It's not the most important thing. However, it is an important factor for consideration because, you know, every early years educator or anybody in this sector also has a life to live. And with the cost of living going up every day, you know, every aspect of their life is being affected. So that is a consideration that now I have to think about. And you're right, we have to move, you know, the goalpost. We need to change the strategy. We need the recognition in the sector very much. It is not about care. It is about care and education. You know, there is much more to it than was first considered, you know. So we've, you know, moved up the expectations of what, you know, qualities and skills and education level individuals need to bring to the sector. That has to have a recompense with it, which isn't being recognized.
Do you not think, though, and this is the kind of a question, a follow-on question for this, is the kind of support, you know, what sort of support we need to do this? And I'm going to just be a bit challenging here because that's my job. But I have been for years going on about the fact that why we call ourselves practitioners and educators and everything under the sun, we actually have failed to really bring to the attention of the world and to parents in particular that what we do is early care and education, early childhood education, early care and early years education, whatever you want to call it in that way. Therefore, our staff should be called teachers. And I used to quote Maria Montessori because Montessori calls all their staff teachers, whether they've done a distance learning course or a full degree and everything else. And I thought, well, that's fair and that's right. And a number of settings are now doing that. And I'm glad to hear Neil use that language of educator and teacher. And I just feel that when you're not even naming things the way it is, you're always going to have difficulty people understanding what it is you do. And so therefore, I think we've moved a long way. And perhaps the early years foundation stage was helpful in this, in giving a framework for us to start thinking more deeply about our own approach to our own, sort of in a sense, our own pedagogical approach to how we approach these, our sort of our arts, craft and science of early years teaching, which is quite a significant thing in itself and a body of knowledge. So I'm wondering then, and I might start with Preeti on this actually, is what kind of support do you think we need from the government to nurseries and preschools and childminders in the sense of the context of this understanding and the fact that Neil's point is made, which is that status is the issue here, continually the issue here, and so therefore what could they do that might be helpful?
I think there's a number of things that need to be considered. I mean, you know, if we're thinking about the funding model, that needs to be looked at because that has a large impact on the pay scale of the teachers who work in the sector. So, you know, that needs to be considered. You know, once the funding model is looked at, you know, what aspect of that is being used in training needs to be considered. Because if we sort of just are satisfied with our teachers or our early years educators being qualified to a certain level and then there being no more training or requirement for training, then that consideration of professionalism goes out of the conversation. So, you know, it shouldn't just be about the statutory training that needs to be considered. It needs to be, you know, that continuous professional development. So support with that needs to be put into place and the recognition for that. And, you know, every single setting, you know, that is open there needs the support in understanding the value of this and the support that they need within their teams, to grow that professionalism. So I think that's the sort of work that needs to come from there. And that can only come from government expectations, I think, because if if the value isn't seen at the top levels, then that's not going to infiltrate to the working mechanisms of everything that is being done in the sector.
Jessica, how would you add to that? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Preeti, no.
I kind of knew you'd want to talk about this somehow, yeah.
I really echo those kind of sentiments. And I think with that churn that you've kind of mentioned of our, who should be representing us, what our strategy should be in how our sector can grow, it's impacted everything. And like you say, calling out educators because that is exactly what they are. They're doing a hugely trusted job that should be massively respected. And I think that for a lot of us, like you've just mentioned, Preeti, that CPD is just coming in huge for busy bees in 2023, because actually, like you've just said, we find that we're getting those level 3 qualifications. Okay, brilliant, you're qualified. Then what's next? If they don't want to do any further qualifications formally, how actually are we making sure that year on year that even our, educators are even able to keep up with the knowledge that we get on how children learn, what we know now, what our society looks like now, contextually, what do we need from our educators to be able to support our communities and our children? And that's a massive thing that we're having to work on, upskilling our seniors to then support that to kind of come through, nursery, and those recognitions that we've had to have more on the CPD or the kind of effort that our educators are putting in each day on annualized reviews or in supervisions, and that constant support that's available. Because I don't know about you guys as well, but obviously with recruitment and that faster churn of staff that we are seeing, the quality in educators coming through that are new to sector does seem to be dropping in our perspective. And we're finding so much that we're having to go right back to basics in our centres and teach things that would have just been really natural when people came out of college, and things that our children need to help to learn. Our teams aren't understanding how schemas are used in play without us going over it again and having those conversations and keeping it fresh in their minds, and doing displays in the staff room about different things that I think to us more experienced sector practitioners perhaps is part of that knowledge that we all have in our minds. And I think the change within the EYFS, where it's not so linear anymore, fantastic. It supports the children as individuals, but I then equally think that practitioners coming through who haven't necessarily got that back kind of knowledge in their minds are a bit like, well, what shall I do next? And as I say, that back to basics is really having to come in and be supported by us upskilling our senior teams so that they're able to upskill their teams in the rooms as well.
I'm sadly to say this is something we're all seeing, and I'm wondering whether and again this is controversial, but whether the fact that so many of our staff come through an apprenticeship route and that they're as good as the centres that they work in is often the problem. And I wonder, Mark, in your role, not necessarily in Tiny, but in your role more generally across nurseries, have you sort of noticed any of this?
Yeah, for sure. And there's a couple of points here I think that's really interesting. And I think Neil's hit the nail on the head. I think it's actually about status that we've got in the sector. And until we stop being a footnote and an afterthought of the education budget and not having a dedicated minister to us, we can do all of this stuff. And we've got, the large nursery groups that are represented here, such as Leaf and Busy Bees, doing some really, really good things. But actually what happens to those independent childminders, those pop-up preschools that are on their own, no one's fighting for them. Neil does a great job to try and fight for them, but actually they need someone battling every single day for the little person in every single part of the industry, and they're not getting it. And I started my career in primary. And I had my own snobbery about early years when I stepped into early years and had this perception of what it was, and very, very quickly learned that my 1 year learning what they do in early years has become my whole career. Because actually to see the level of evidence-based and theory-based practice that we do, I find it fascinating now in some of the work that I do with a couple of charities, stepping into primary schools and watching some really poor practice, some really out-of-date, non-evidence-based practice happening. And I think the childminders wouldn't mind me saying, the ones that I've been working with recently that are former primary school teachers, they're actually some of the childminders that we have to give the most training to, because their perception of education, teaching, and of supporting children is not modern. It's very much about worksheet model, very much about the children sit and listen, and we're going to impart all that knowledge. So I think we've got to improve the status that we are recognised with, because until we get that recognition, and we need to do it with ourselves as well, we have this whole level of kind of status within our own sector. You know, childminders I'm now seeing at the bottom of the pile, having stepped in, and seeing this snobbery from other colleagues and previous colleagues saying, oh, you're working with childminders, whereas actually there's some childminders doing some really amazing stuff on a really local level that should be really celebrated. So I think we first got to try and get rid of this status system that we hold, where, you know, at the bottom you've got the childminders and you've got the pop-up preschools, and actually start realizing that there's some really great work happening, and there's some really great settings like that, and there's some really terrible settings like that, and there's some really great big large settings, and there's some really poor large settings. You know, we're all in this together, so let's try and break down the status that we've got and then try and do that on a wider scale. And yeah, definitely with the training model, I think it depends what your training got. Childminders actually don't have a recognised qualification at all for childminders, so they have to do the early years practitioner qualifications, which, you know, actually it doesn't give them all the skills that they need. And then you look at something like the Leaf apprenticeship groups that I've worked with that have actually gone and you've created your own thing that actually works for the sector, but there is just not any national conversation. And this is what you bang on about all the time. We need to coordinate all this stuff. We all go off and do our own little thing, but we are not pulling anything together. And until we do that on a larger scale, rather than just kind of us guys here trying to pull it together, we need that represented nationally. I
think that merits a question for a note from Neil on that one, actually. I think there's a call out to you there, Neil.
well, I was going to say, actually, Mark, I think we try. You're absolutely spot on. We try our best from the outside in making a case for the early years. And I'd like to think, you know, with things that we've done in terms of the freedom of information requests, where government were forced to tell us that they'd short-funded the sector by £2 billion, that we have demonstrated as an organisation that we favour absolutely no one, and we hold them to account. But your point is that we should have that from the inside. We should have somebody that believes in the early years. So my comment when I said about a cabinet minister, and I also said I felt that we should have somebody that represents us in terms of ministerial roles that has a backbone, because I don't think we've had that. I think they've basically bowed to Treasury and bowed to number 10. Nobody's stood up. Nobody's been strong enough and said, this is what's important for our future. This is what's important for basically our children. Nobody has done that. There's an interesting point here, I think, in as much as on the DFE website, if you dig really deeply, and they haven't removed it yet, but June, you may recall this, but back in 2013, they created a visual, and the visual, which I say is still there if you dig deep, is 5 guiding principles that they should follow, the DFE, in terms of policy formers. So ministers and officials should follow when they create policy. And 2 of those say this. One of them says, will it work? So I have to confess, when we were thinking about ratios and the proposal put forward by Liz Truss, and we know that nobody is going to pass any money back to parents. In fact, you know, I have concerns that it would create a bit of a free-for-all in terms of prices having to increase. Absolutely. But regardless, will it work is one of the questions they should ask, but they've completely ignored that. The most important one is, who made you the expert? So they should have asked themselves, who is the expert in this? But they don't listen to the experts. They don't listen to the sector. They don't trust anybody in the sector. All they will do is follow the pound note. This is all about money, not about principles, not about the family, nothing more than a pot of money. And that's what's devastating. If you had somebody on the inside, a cabinet minister with some guile, with aspirations, with integrity, with a conscience, and a bold minister, that's what needs to move. Then we'd move the rhetoric. We would using terms like educators and and teachers. And I mean, you know, one for you, I'll throw this in just before I shut up, is that I don't think the term childminder does anybody any credit. They do much more than mind children. They educate children. They're home-based educators and teachers. So, you know, I've got to say, we're doing it in group settings. You might want to lead the move to change that term childminder, because I think it's derogatory.
It's an interesting conversation, actually. It's one we've just been having and talking with other sector leaders from different countries about what they kind of term themselves. So I think that's definitely an interesting debate in itself, because I would agree, just like we use nursery nurse, you know, actually childminder, it kind of harks from that time, doesn't it? Where actually the appreciation for the breadth of the role that someone does on their own, having to lead themselves, and all the policy and all the practice and all of the requirements that you'd have a manager and a deputy to manage in a setting, it does them a disservice, I think. Yeah.
Headline definitely. In the Telegraph just a few months ago, headline in the Telegraph, when the ratio proposal was put forward, said changing the ratios would allow, sorry June, would allow nursery workers to look after, or no, to watch more children.
Yes,
that's what we do. We watch children.
It took us back. I mean, Neil and I have been in the sector a long time, and but that took us back to the sort of 1500s when we talked about dame schools. It really did. But just to move us on, I'm wondering about parents. I mean, I think my argument has been for quite some time that we need parents to understand also what we do. But in the meantime, are you seeing situations where parents are in a bit of a bad state and actually quite worried about their circumstances? I mean, I think you alluded to it, Jessica, when you started at the beginning, when you were talking about home learning and reducing hours and all that thing, and Pretty as well. Are you seeing that kind of thing changing? Are you worried about some of your parents? I mean, we're doing food banks at Leaf, and we've got this, that, and the other going on to support them. But that to me seems like a real sticking plaster approach to things. But, you know, people are human and you want to do stuff to help. What's your experience, either of you?
Jessica, if you want to start.
I think from us, like you say, June, you know, there's lots of like initiatives that you can do. We're doing food banks if people need it, help yourselves. We're doing clothes swaps, so different age clothing, bring it in and just take what you need, coats, etc. But like you say, it does feel like a sticking plaster, a bit of a token gesture, because then we're also handing you that month's invoice because we've got bills to pay ourselves. You know, everything's gone up for everybody. We have really tried to put a serious increase on staff wages this year and again next year as well. But I think it comes back to, again, that recognition, that support, that churn. And actually, like you say, you know, we've all mentioned it's very vocational working as educators. And actually, although people need a certain amount to live off, absolutely, they do it because they love the children that they work with and they're passionate about educating the children, giving them the best start in life. And if we can support them to do that effectively, I do believe that people will stay. And if we can find ways as a kind of country, I guess, to recognise them appropriately and fairly, then it's not going to have such a kind of stigma attached to it. Oh, you just watch the children, you just do this, you just do that. And people will be much more motivated to do the job that I do believe they really do love. I think that recognition from parents, from our perspective, is coming through a bit more because our doors have been reopened. It's almost like fresh eyes on the different things that we're doing. And I think because people have been forced to be at home trying to educate their own children a bit more, they've gone, oh, right, is this what you do all day? So, you know, I think we do feel that we've almost had a bit of renewed respect from our parents, which is a really, really positive thing to kind of build on and try and take that the next step further and really encourage and run with those brilliant relationships that we're kind of creating. And then I think the recognition as well of like childcare costs and that it's not necessarily us, we need help and we need support to be able to continue the quality childcare that we are providing, is running alongside all these changes in our government. What are they providing for us? What's happening? You know, there's so many campaigns now, isn't there, going on from lots of different influencers and on social media and things to get that support brought in better. And I think we do have parents right beside us and with us for this, instead of just going, yeah, from the sidelines, because of the impact and how they need that help. And like I say, that kind of renewed respect, really.
That's really interesting. And can I just double check before we listen to Pretty's comment on this? But did you say you have opened up your doors? Because I understand that some nurseries are still not opening their doors to their parents, and they're still expected to meet the children outside. Is that what you just said?
Yeah, we've opened pretty much all of our nurseries again.
Yeah, no, because I struggle a little bit with that from a pedagogical perspective and from a trust perspective, but I guess that argument is for another day. Pretty, what's your thoughts on this?
It's a really interesting one, actually, and I think what Jessica sort of touched upon. I think one good thing that's come out of COVID is that recognition of the role of early years in our communities, and I think a lot of parents have recognized, it's not about looking after the children or just watching them, or whatever terminology that had been used before. There is much more to it. So I think that the recognition definitely has changed, as has the understanding that quality comes at a price. However, having said that, it's not possible for every parent to be able to pay the price for that quality, and that's the challenge that we're facing. So I think it's about recognizing that we need to support everybody who comes into this sector, in order to have the provision that we want to have for our children, who are our future. So these first 5 years of a child's life, we recognize are the most important years of their lives. So we must make sure that quality provision is available to every single child, not just certain groups of children. And that has to come, from the dictate of government, just as we sort of look at the statutory schooling age and the support that they get. Although, every stage of education could do with more support. I absolutely recognize that. But I think, we need to have that recognition that support needs to start early. It needs to be there for early years. And then parents, can really truly work in partnership with educators in terms of supporting the development of their children. So it's not about, providing them with the basics of life that, Jessica and others are trying to do in their early year settings, by providing, the food banks, as you mentioned, June, or the clothes swap. Those are the basic necessities. It's more about how do we support our children? How do we help them, develop the skills that we need them to develop into adulthood.
I totally agree with you. And of course, the entire LEAF model is based on the principle that every child should have access to affordable, high quality education. And our whole model is that we can show that that's possible. And it drives me to distraction that, that can't be picked up by government to actually see that there's room for all sorts of models in the sector, but ours actually works. And of course, I don't know about this, Neil, but my last look was that the number of places for children from more disadvantaged environments and backgrounds had actually decreased, and reduction in nurseries for those children it's probably got worse, has it?
Well, it's interesting, June, in as much as it's pretty obvious, in as much as that I keep saying in as much as, because I keep trying to convince myself that the idea that we are in a position whereby there's lots of activities in terms of mergers and acquisitions, and I appreciate that if you're in business, that's what you do. But the reality is that most of the conversations that I have where people are trying to come into the sector, they're asking me fundamentally 3 questions at this particular point in time. And this is a long-winded way of answering your question, but I think we will get there, and I'll try and do it quickly. The first is, has the market recovered? And these are usually international investors. Has the market recovered? Well, of course, in many instances, occupancy has come back, but many nurseries are unable to open. So I say nurseries and preschools, it may be the same with childminders as well, but are unable to operate the same hours that they used to, or open the same rooms because they don't have the staff to do it. So that's the first point. Has the market recovered? The second is, how likely is it that government will extend the number of free hours that they give to parents. And I use the word lightly when I say free hours, because they are generally concerned that that will shut down the opportunity to cross-subsidize where government have shortchanged, cheated providers of adequate funding. And again, I don't use that word lightly, but it's there in their freedom of information response that they have shortchanged the sector. The third question is, how likely will it be, given the rulings in terms of some of the ombudsmen, in terms of how the free entitlement is applied, how likely is it that government will enforce stricter conditions on the delivery of the so-called free entitlement? It is inevitable, it is absolutely inevitable that will impact operators in areas of deprivation and, I have to say, rural communities where they cannot recruit. So whatever the statistics are at this particular point in time, it is inevitable that we are going to go down a path where if you have, you will get better care and quality in terms of early years. And if you have not, you will struggle to find a place. So I think it's pretty obvious that it will impact on the more deprived communities, full stop.
Thank you, Neil. And I totally agree with you. And it's exactly what we're seeing. And it's very depressing. And I think Preeti's point earlier about children are the responsibility of the entire society is a mark, you know, it kind of raises that very, very clearly. Now, guys, we have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you one quick question each. So imagine as Christmas comes up and we have all the John Lewis ads and all that awful sentimental music going on now on the television as they fill our screens with sugar in an obesity crisis. But there we are. What one thing, if you had that magic wand for a second, what one thing would you do to actually make things better for this children, the staff and parents and the sector as a whole? And I'm going to start with Mark.
I think for me that the main overarching theme would be time. And I think, you know, we're rushing at the moment to paper over so many cracks that it would be great to just give time to teachers, children and parents to find out what they need and how they are, just as a check-in point. And I think that's a really big thing we're missing. And I'm just going to link this back very cheekily to the point on parents that you just raised as well. And I think there's a really big conversation to be had with also the parent anxiety post-COVID of what early years education looks like. There's this huge fear at the moment that they need kind of enforced academia in early years settings, and the need for them to be taught and to be really formally educated. And I think, you know, actually spending time with parents to help them see all the stuff that we're trying to help our teachers and our childminders and childminders assistants to find, I think actually we need to make sure we're replicating that conversation with parents, so that actually we're enabling our teachers and childminders to do the job that they need to do, so that they're not constantly having a battle with parents' perception of what high quality looks like. So yeah, overarching I think would be time
And the slowed pedagogy. That I think pretty given Montessori's wonderful work, I think that might be you should have the next wand really, because that kind of might follow on from some of Mark's comments about time and just being.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I think, you know, it's letting children be children. I think that's the really important thing. And I think, you know, there's been such a push post-COVID, as Mark has sort of indicated or, you know, suggested, that there's this push for this academia and the academic results that we're pushing for. But I think we need to remember that children have to be children, and you know, we need to give them that time, that opportunity to be exactly that, and everything else will fall into place. So, you know, that real sort of focus on that social emotional learning and that opportunity for children to explore, for the children to repeat, for the children to just be, you know, if that's what they need, is really key. And I think we sometimes forget that in all of everything that needs to be done, and perhaps some of the pressures that we are feeling, whether they are perceived pressures or real pressures, you know, that's another debate, I think. But it's not getting sort of caught up in all of that, and letting children be children.
Thank you very much. Jessica?
I think mine goes along the same thread, definitely, and I would say it would be well-being, that I would wave my wand and support for everybody for all of our children, to, you know, make sure that they're feeling well supported and their well-being's protected, but also for all of our teams and our educators. And I think, as we've all mentioned, you know, with the sector how it is, and that kind of downward look towards what they do every day, that they do so amazingly, we make sure that they feel, you know, well supported and well loved for the brilliant job that they do.
Thank you, Jessica. And I hope you're a regular reader of the book that I wrote with Lala Manners on wellbeing for the staff, which was last year's Christmas present to the staff. Neil.
Slightly tongue-in-cheek, I think I've already had one of my Christmas presents already, in as much as the biggest proponent of deregulation and ratios is no longer a youth officer. So that is a good start, I would suggest. And the reverse of that, therefore, is that whoever comes in and holds the post responsible for early years is different, because that's what we need. We need somebody to be different, to prioritize early years. Personally, I would love an independent review where we all get to objectively put in our pennies worth. So providers, health, whatever it happens to be, every aspect of child development. So we look at what is a useful, effective strategy, not for today, but for 5 to 10 years' time. And we can look back and be proud of our early years system. If I could just say this final things. When I came in June to the sector, somebody said to me, you can judge the integrity of a government by the way in which it treats its young children, but more importantly, the way it treats the people that cares for its young children. Somebody like that would be fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. I can see Lisa is back on the screen, panicking that we won't finish on time. Thank you all for your contributions. Of course, my Christmas present would be a national strategy wrapped up in glitter, but that we never, ever have to hear the word practitioner ever, ever, ever again. And from now on, me and Maria Montessori totally agree that everyone is an early years teacher. I don't know how you have difficulty saying that word. If you can say educator, you can say teacher. But thank you again. And I'm sure this will provide quite a lot of thought and food for thought for anyone listening when it is unrecorded or shared as a recording.
Oh, thank you, June. And I hope all of you enjoyed watching that. Like June just said, there was lots of food for thought in there. So I hope you all enjoyed it. And a huge thanks to the panellists, Preeti Patel, Neil Leach, Jessica Sandell, Mark James, and of course, June O'Sullivan. So thank you very much for being a part of this. Coming up next, we're going to hear from Vanessa Dooley, who is going to be asking you if you're ready for your inspection.